This is Pope Francis, and this on his head is a mitre. It is the formal headgear worn on ceremonial occasions by high-ranking church officials in the Catholic Church, as well as other churches like the Lutheran and Anglican churches. Church officials of the various branches of Orthodox Christianity also wear a mitre, though while Orthodox bishops wear a rounded mitre, the Catholic version looks kind of like two triangular points split by a swooping indentation. The design has fueled public speculation about the mitre's origins. Some have said that the hat looks kind of like a fish's mouth, perhaps relating to the use of the fish as an early Christian symbol, though others have suggested from an anti-Catholic perspective that the fish mouth shape is a reference to the ancient Syrian god Dagon, which has no basis in reality at all. The mitre's shape has nothing to do with fish imagery, nor an ancient god, but its history does provide a fascinating window into Christian symbolism and its connections with Jewish history. Now, we don't know the exact origins of the mitre, though the topic has been explored by scholars such as Dr. Ruth Mellenkopf, as well as Dr. Katie Turner, an expert on ancient Jewish clothing and its reinterpretation throughout Christian history. She helped a ton on this video, and you can check out an interview I conducted with her on my second channel, link in the description below. In the earliest centuries of Christian history, there was no standard formal headdress for early Christian leaders. In fact, one wouldn't emerge for nearly 1,000 years. But by around the 8th century CE, we have evidence for leaders such as the Pope wearing a cone-shaped or helmet-shaped hat called a camelacum, which was a type of headgear worn by officials in the Byzantine imperial court. By the 12th century, however, the cone shape of the hat was altered by adding a decorative fabric band down the middle. The hat was soft, so the band pushed down the middle of the hat, forming two soft mounds on either side, shown here on a 12th century chess piece of a bishop. Just like how a bishop in a modern game of chess often looks like a modern mitre, a medieval chess piece reflects the church uniform of the time. By the mid-12th century, the two mounds of the headgear were stiffened using a stiff fabric lining inside of the hat, forming a horn-like shape. This new hat became known as the cornua, Latin for horn. And also in the 12th century, the hat was rotated so that the horns were front and back. However, as the art historian Ruth Mellenkopf stresses in her research, we should not imagine these as exclusive phases of development, but rather they overlapped. One community may have retained an older form of the mitre, while others simultaneously started using the rotated front-back form. So why did the bishop's mitre take on a horn shape? The reshaping of the mitre into the form of horns likely originated in the Latin translation of Exodus 34:29. In this passage, Moses returns from the presence of God on Mount Sinai, holding the two tablets of the covenant. According to Exodus, the face of Moses shone because he had been talking with God. So much so that his brother Aaron and the other Israelites were afraid to speak with Moses. When this passage was translated from Hebrew into Latin by the church father Jerome, he translated the Hebrew term for shone or radiant with the Latin word cornuta, or horned. This seems pretty random, but Jerome chose this word because in late antiquity, horned had a metaphorical meaning of empowered or glorified. Pick up your copy of the Latin Vulgate Bible today and you'll see the word cornuta, which means we can literally translate this verse as his face was horned from the conversation of the Lord. This is why you often see Moses depicted in Christian art as having physical horns on his head, like here in Michelangelo's sculpture of Moses. Jerome's Latin translation, originally metaphorical, came to be reinterpreted as a literal physical description by later artists. While today many might interpret this negatively, like how Satan stereotypically is portrayed with horns, back then this was a thoroughly positive translation. Someone who is horned is glorified. This ancient double meaning of this Latin term also helps explain why the bishop's mitre took on a horn shape. It represented the glorified power of Christian leaders. A 12th century theologian named Petrus Cantor said that the horns of the mitre signified the bishop's ability to cast down the enemies with the horns of the Old and New Testament. Connecting the so-called horns to the Old and New Testament became a common metaphor. The 12th century Pope Innocent III wrote that the mitre signifies the knowledge of both testaments, for the two horns are the two testaments. So the horn shape of the mitre originated in a Western Christian translation and interpretation of a passage from the Hebrew Bible, used by Christian writers and artists to underscore the power and authority of Christian leaders. So how do we get from the side-horned mitre to the front-back mitre? As we've touched on briefly, the horns of the earliest mitre apparently sat on each side, around the temples. But by the end of the 12th century, the mitre was rotated 90 degrees, such that the horns sat in the front and back of the wearer's head. This came to be the standard version and is still worn today. The rationale for this rotation is unknown, though the scholar Katie Turner theorizes in her upcoming book, Costuming Christ, which should be published next year, that this switch was due to Christian supersessionist theology, the idea that Christians have replaced Jews as the people of God. Later Christian writers interpreted this positioning as reflecting the priority of the New Testament over the Old Testament. The horn in the front represented the New Testament and thus had precedence over the horn in the back, representing the Old Testament. In this way, the front-back horned mitre came to be understood as part of Christian supersessionist claims to the heritage of Judaism. This switch from the side-horned mitre to the front-back mitre led to an interesting development in Christian art. The older side-horned version became a visual symbol for old-fashioned. It became an easy way for your audience to distinguish between a historical figure from long ago versus a contemporary person. In other words, a character wearing a side-horned mitre in a painting signals that that person belongs to an earlier bygone era of history. In fact, the visual technique was eventually extended to biblical figures. Figures from the Hebrew Bible, such as Aaron, the brother of Moses, were depicted wearing a side-horned mitre. Originally, the side-horned mitre was a largely positive symbol, a way to signal that biblical heroes such as Aaron were equivalent to proto-Christians. By wearing an older version of the headgear worn by contemporary church leaders, you created a symbolic link between the Hebrew Bible and modern Christians. But eventually, Christian artists came to associate the old-fashioned connotations of the older headgear with what they viewed as the outdated and obsolete Jewish law. And this is where the imagery of the side-horned mitre, originally a symbol of glorification, takes a negative turn. According to research conducted by Dr. Katie Turner and Dr. Rob Priest, Christians began to use the side-horned mitre to depict Jewish priests in order to signal their outdatedness. This can be seen in the derogatory use of the side-horned mitre for Jewish figures in Christian passion plays, theatrical performances of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ that are typically performed around Easter. Dr. Turner and Dr. Priest point to evidence such as costume directions from a late 15th century passion play that orders that the high priests Annas and Caiaphas appear as a bishop of the Old Law, with a mitre on their head after the Old Law. According to the Gospels, Caiaphas was the high priest during the crucifixion of Jesus, and played a role in the plot against him. He's often portrayed in Christian art with a side-horned mitre. Passion play costumes for the character Caiaphas from the German town of Oberammergau, dating as far back as the 1700s, show that they were portrayed with side-horned headgear. Turner and Priest argue in their research that many Protestant audience members would have picked up on the subtext of these costumes, as an exaggerated caricature of priests, giving these passion plays an anti-Catholic clergy vibe along with the anti-Semitism. These costumes and other elements of the Oberammergau Passion Play came under heavy criticism as anti-Semitic by the 1980s, and the costumes were abolished by the 21st century. The mitre has also been a target of anti-Catholic imagery. For example, check out this political cartoon which was published in Harper's Weekly in 1871. The cartoon depicts Catholic bishops as crocodiles, crawling out of the water and advancing toward the United States, represented as a public school. A Protestant minister shields terrified school kids from the voracious crocodilian creatures. This cartoon was a piece of anti-Catholic propaganda, criticizing the perceived influence of the Catholic Church on education. Catholics at the time were pulling their kids out of largely Protestant-influenced public schools and forming their own Catholic schools. This sparked a surge of anti-Catholic sentiment as Protestant Americans criticized these parochial schools as un-American. So the shape of the mitre doesn't have any connection with fish, nor with a fish god. As an aside, the Syrian god Dagon was not a fish god at all. That idea is completely fabricated. You can learn more about this in a video by the scholar Dan McClellan. But the history of the mitre demonstrates how Christian art and culture can sometimes have multiple and shifting meanings. What started as a positive metaphorical translation in late antiquity became a physical headdress, a symbolic representation of Christian authority, and an occasional target of anti-Catholic misinformation. Being a religious studies scholar, I'm no stranger to studying conflict. My latest obsession is Real Life Lore's Nebula original series, War Room. Each episode is a monthly deep dive into ongoing conflicts around the world. You can expect some incisive geopolitical analysis, and you can watch it exclusively on Nebula. Nebula is an independent video platform where Nebula creators like myself have a mission to be the best possible place for creators to make content that we couldn't make anywhere else. A place where we can elevate ourselves to the next level. And Nebula originals are a great example of this. If you like evolutionary biology, the series Becoming Human by Real Science is an amazing journey through major landmarks of human evolution. If you're a fan of archaeology, there's Archaeology Quest, where two creators try to see if they could hack it while living in the Neolithic era. And we've even launched our own Nebula film studio, and are producing a movie called Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend that got covered in Variety magazine. At Nebula, we've created the solution for making high-quality content that's just as good as traditional media, but gives all the power to the creator. So if you want to watch any of the amazing things we made over on Nebula, while at the same time directly supporting the creators who made it, sign up for Nebula by going to nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast. Using my code gets you 40% off an annual plan. Now, just a heads up, starting September 1st, Nebula's price will be increasing for new subscribers. New subscribers will pay $6 a month or $60 a year, which means using my code, annual plans will be discounted to $36 per year. Now, this will only impact new subscribers. There are no plans at all to change pricing for existing subscribers. So if you've been interested in Nebula but have never gotten around to signing up, now's the time. And we also have a lifetime plan at $300. Just pay once and get access to Nebula forever. That might be a good option for you if you don't want another monthly subscription. So again, go to nebula.tv/religionforbreakfast. Thanks, everyone.